It is now my, I'm thrilled now to introduce our next speaker, Professor David Clough. David Clough is Professor of Theological Ethics at the University of Chester. He has recently completed the landmark 2-volume monograph on animals, on which he worked between 2012 and 2019, and which is about the place of animals in Christian theology and ethics. He is the co-founder of Creature Kind, an organization engaging Christians with farmed animal welfare. He is the founder of Default Veg and the principal investigator of a 3-year project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council on the Christian ethics of farmed animal welfare in partnership with major UK churches. Professor Clough is also a Methodist lay preacher and has represented the Methodist Church on national ecumenical working groups on the ethics of warfare and climate change. So Professor Clough, it is my great pleasure to hand the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clara, for that introduction. And thanks to you, Chris, and CCA colleagues for putting on this conference and for the invitation to address you. So in this paper, my aim is to present a Christian ethical argument that the welfare of farmed fish should be included alongside consideration of the welfare of other farmed animals. Considering the ethics of the human treatment of fish has important implications for the operation of wild capture fisheries, as we've already heard, but my focus will be on the implications for UK fish farming, where regulation is shockingly underdeveloped in comparison with other farmed animals. The analysis I present derived from my current AHRC funded project, as Clara mentioned, on the Christian ethics of farmed animal welfare, on which the Catholic Church is represented by Bishop John, for which we're very grateful. And among the other partner organisations, we're very glad to include Catholic Concern for Animals, who've been a great help to us through the project. I'll begin with a quick overview of UK fish farming. Then I'll consider the philosophical and theological understandings of fish that underlie current attitudes, which relate to some of the questions I think we've already discussed. And then turn to asking to what extent UK fish farming systems enable the flourishing of fish. So let's start with UK fish farming. The large-scale farming of fish for human food is a recent development in the UK, dating only from the 1960s. Wooden fish traps were used in rivers in prehistoric times. A very few Romans may have used fish ponds to supply fresh fish, and medieval monasteries used fish ponds to supplement other sources of fish. Salmon and trout were bred in the 19th century to enhance fish stocks for anglers. But the farming of fish for food at scale has developed only over the past half century. It's one striking indication of the way that fish are treated differently from other farmed animals, that the numbers of farmed fish are not reported in the UK, but the Farmed Animal Welfare Committee estimated in 2014 that 180 million salmon and trout eggs are laid down each year in the UK, which would make fish farming second only to farming chickens for meat in terms of the numbers of animals involved. The UK is the third largest producer of finfish globally. Aquaculture, as we've heard, has expanded rapidly across the world within the same period as its growth in the UK, increasing from a negligible volume in the early 1960s to 53% of global human consumption of fish for food in 2016. And the novelty of the practice of fish farming in the UK is represented in the relationship of farmed fish to wild fish populations. UK farmed salmon, for example, are only between 3 and 15 generations from their wild ancestors. So these are animals that are much, much closer to wild animals than other farmed species. Over 360 fish species are farmed around the world, and these have a great diversity of physical characteristics, natural behaviours, and optimal habitats. The two major species of fish farmed in the UK are from the Salmonidae family, the Atlantic salmon representing about 91% of production by weight, and the rainbow trout, which makes up about 8%. 15 other species, including brown trout, sea bass, halibut, carp, and tilapia, are also farmed in the UK and make up the remaining 1%. Shellfish species such as mussels, scallops, and oysters are also farmed in significant numbers. I won't discuss them further in this paper, but the practice in relation to them also merits ethical attention. My focus on in this paper is on the welfare of farmed fish, but we need also to recognise that feeding farmed fish also impacts negatively on wild fish populations, because on average we feed about twice as much wild fish to farmed fish in order to get a particular weight of fish out of farmed systems, which is remarkable. But also feeding farm fish impacts negatively on indigenous peoples, wild animal habitats, and human food security, because they're fed human food crops such as soy, and so contribute to problems that people will be aware of in relation to deforestation and so on. Fish are often understood as categorically different from other farmed animals such as mammals and birds. They've often been excluded from moral consideration, even when protections have been given to other kinds of animals. In the UK, fish are explicitly excluded from legislation on farmed animal welfare, and there is no legislation specifying conditions for how they should be kept. They are not specifically included in regulations on veterinary medicine, and there is no requirement for a person trained in animal welfare to be present when they are transported or slaughtered, unlike other farmed animals. Fish are covered under general animal welfare legislation in the UK, but there has never been any enforcement actions or prosecutions for any welfare issues in relation to fish farming in England and Wales, which is remarkable. And even the most demanding certification scheme for farmed fish, as I'll discuss later, makes no reference to the environment in which fish are kept and environmental enrichment. Okay, so I'm going to switch now from an overview to thinking about the history of fish in philosophy and theology, and fish as a Christian ethical concern. The widespread exclusion of fish from ethical concern is rooted in early philosophical and theological understandings. The Jewish thinker Philo of Alexandria, a contemporary of Jesus Christ, used a hierarchy among animal creatures, with humans at the top and fish at the bottom. He considered fish as insignificant and of little value, on the borderline between living and non-living beings, possessing a soul principle rather than a soul, which merely served to preserve their bodies, he said. It may be that he inherited this view from Plato, who wrote in the Timaeus that fish were condemned to live in the sea because they derived from the most stupid humans. Later in the 1st century, Lamprias, a character in one of Plutarch's dialogues, claims that eating animals from the sea is less problematic than eating land animals, because land animals, quote, consume the same food and breathe the same air as we do, and drink and bathe in water no different from us. For them. Our world is equivalent to Hades for them, since to come here is instant death. And when I discovered this passage from Plutarch, I was really struck how close and how far this 2,000-year-old dialogue anticipates a great deal of current speculation about why we think about fish so differently. We lack a shared environment. We lack the ability to interpret their gaze or facial expression. We are unable to hear their voices, and we therefore do not stand in the same relationship to them. Basil of Caesarea, a later Christian theologian, shares the conclusion that fish do not have reason, and adds that their hearing and sight is poor, and that they have no memory, imagination, or recognition of the familiar. Basil is nonetheless full of wonder in relation to their astonishing diversity and their mass collective migrations, appealing in his Hexameron to his congregation not to despise fish for their lack of capacity, but to admire their fidelity to the laws of God. St. Augustine, however, is convinced that Basil is wrong and that fish do have memory on the basis both of reading accounts of others and his own observation. And when Clara was talking about her own experience, I was put in mind of this quotation from Augustine. So listen to this. But some have held the opinion that fish are not called living beings, but creeping. They have no memory and no vital operation that resembles reason. But these writers have failed to observe the facts of experience, says Augustine, for there are authors who have recorded many astounding phenomena observed in fish ponds. But whatever may be said about the truth or falsity of these accounts, the fact that fish have a memory is beyond question. I myself have observed this fact, and anyone who has the occasion and the desire may do likewise. There is at Bulla Regia a large fountain abundantly stocked with fish. Whenever an object is thrown into the pond by a person above, the fish carry it off as they swim by or tear it apart in their struggle to possess it. Having become used to being fed in this way, whenever people walk by the edge of the fountain, the fish will swim in schools back and forth alongside them, waiting for a morsel from those whose presence they perceive. Augustine's convictions about the cognitive capacities of fish, supported by his own experience, are also supported by an alternative strand in Roman thought that has a much higher estimation of their abilities than Plato and Philo. Plutarch's work, Whether Land or Sea Animals Are Cleverer, draws on Aristotle and from a variety of earlier compendia containing examples of the intelligence of fish, including Aelian, Pliny, and Philo's own work on animals. Phaedimus, in Plutarch's dialogue, makes the case for the intelligence of fish through examples such as fish responding to their names, the care anglers need to take to deceive fish, the bravery of sea bass in escaping from a fishing hook, the cooperation of parrotfish in helping their fellows escape, the hunting strategies of starfish, the ability of octopuses to change color, of pilotfish to guide whales, and the maternal care shown by the dogfish. Again, this is collections of stories about the intelligence of fish that are 2,000 years old. Early Christian attitudes to fish seem to reflect belief in a categorical difference between them and other animals. Eating fish was common and uncontroversial, even among groups such as the Marcionites who avoided meat, perhaps because fish was not connected with the sacrificial system, or because it was associated with food provided in gratuitous abundance by God, rather than being the result of human labor. Fish appear in various stories about Jesus in the Gospels. We've heard some of them referenced already. Jesus calls the first disciples away from their nets to fish for people instead. In his teaching, Jesus uses the example of a father responding to the request of his son for a fish. After an unsuccessful fishing trip, Jesus guides the disciples to a miraculous catch. Jesus teaches that the kingdom of God is like a net filled with fish of every kind, some of which are put into baskets while others are thrown out. Jesus feeds a crowd of 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Jesus pays the temple tax by asking Peter to cast a hook and take a coin from the mouth of the fish he catches. And the resurrected Jesus cooks a breakfast of bread and fish for the disciples and eats grilled fish in another resurrection appearance. While it is highly likely that Jesus ate lamb at Passover as an observant Jew, the fact that fish is the only animal product he is recorded as eating in the Gospels suggested it was considered very different from other animal products. Beyond the Gospels, there are many other biblical reference points for considering fish in a Christian context. As we've heard, all the creatures of the sea are blessed and instructed to multiply and fill the waters on the 5th day of creation in the first creation narrative, alongside a similar provision for the birds of the air. Fish are included in the dominion granted to humankind over other creatures later in the same chapter, echoed in Psalm 8. Fish are conspicuous in not being destroyed by the great flood in Genesis 6-8 and not being in need of protection on the ark. They're among the animals that God declares will be fearful of and legitimate food for humans after the flood in Genesis 9. Since they do not emerge from the ark, they're not obviously included in the Noahide covenant God makes with Noah and every living creature that is with you, or every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth, though they might be considered as within the alternative phrasing of every living creature of all flesh in Genesis 9. Fish die as a result of the first plague when the Nile turns to blood. Solomon's wisdom of the natural world included an ability to speak about fish. Job advises his comforters to seek wisdom from the fish of the sea alongside animals and birds. Ecclesiastes uses the image of fish taken in a cruel net to describe mortals in calamity. And Amos describes the fate of the inhabitants of Bashan as being taken with fish hooks. Ezekiel prophesies that fish will quake together with other animals at the coming of the Lord, and Zephaniah declares that fish will be destroyed as part of the judgment on Judah. Ezekiel's final vision is of a great river flowing from the sanctuary into the sea that will provide a home for very many fish of different kinds, though he adds providing good opportunities for fishing. Hosea prophesies that fish perish alongside other creatures as part of the languishing of the land because there is no knowledge of the Lord. And as we've heard, a great fish is obedient to God in swallowing Jonah to protect him from drowning and subsequently spewing him onto dry land. And Paul finally instructs the church in Corinth that there are different kinds of flesh for humans, birds, beasts, and fish. Again, as we've heard, fish are also prominent in early Christian symbolism. The acronym ichthus, standing for Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior in Greek, led to the simple line drawing of a fish becoming a symbol for Jesus Christ and for his followers. Tertullian pictures Christians as little fishes born in the water, following their ichthus, their big fish, Jesus Christ, and safe only while they swim in the water. But other Christian authors depicted the sea negatively as an environment from which Christian souls needed to be rescued. And so that image of the net, interestingly, used as a symbol of rescue from this sort of alien negative environment. Early Christian art depicts sheep under the protection of a shepherd and fish swimming in the water of life as parallel images of the Christian soul in a state of bliss. Interestingly, fish are the direct objects of Christian preaching in the story of St. Anthony of Padua, a follower of St. Francis, who after preaching to heretics in Rimini for several days without success, was inspired by God to stand on the bank at the mouth of the river Marecchia and address the fish instead. A great multitude of fish approach him and arrange themselves peaceably in order of size, with the smaller ones closest to him where the water was shallower. You can find images of this online if you have a look. Anthony tells the fish that they should be thankful to God for giving them such a noble element for their dwelling, with many places for refuge from the tempest, for blessing them to increase and multiply, for preserving them when all other creatures perished in the flood, and for allowing them to serve God by keeping the prophet Jonah safe, providing the temple for Jesus, the temple coin for Jesus, and nourishing Jesus. During the sermon, the numbers of fish increased, and afterwards the fishes opened their mouths, bowed their heads, and expressed their reverence and praise. Anthony gave thanks to God that the fish honored God more than humans did. And then the humans around were touched by the miracle and converted, and the fish went away rejoicing in God's blessing. So there we've got a fish-specific sermon, which I find fascinating. Christian attitudes to fish and to consuming fish have followed other traditions of thought in considering them categorically different from birds and mammals. Some of these attitudes have been justified on the basis of negative judgments about the capacities of fish, such as the belief that fish are unable to think, communicate, or experience pain. Recent findings about the sentience and cognitive abilities of fish, discussed in the following section, provide good reasons to reconsider the exclusion of fish from the kinds of ethical concern shown to other kinds of animals. The particular prominence of fish as a symbol of Jesus Christ and the followers of Christ is potentially an additional reason for Christians to be attentive to the question of whether fish can flourish in farmed environments. The Christian Ethics of Farmed Animal Welfare research project that I mentioned at the outset has developed a Christian approach to the ethics of farmed animal welfare based on the extent to which farmed animals can flourish in farmed context. Our policy framework, published in November and available from the CEFAW website, sets out the position that Christian belief in God's care for every creature is best expressed through an approach to farmed animal welfare based on the flourishing of farmed animals. Christian concern for farmed animal flourishing goes beyond narrower interpretations of farmed animal welfare that focus only on avoiding pain, disease, and distress. Farmed animals glorify God by fully living out their particular abilities, activities, relationships, and characteristics. Their flourishing is threatened when they're subjected to impoverished environments and painful mutilations, when they're deprived of social relationships, when they're selectively bred or genetically manipulated to prioritize productivity over welfare. CEFAW proposes that these criteria should apply to fish alongside chickens, sheep, pigs, cattle, and other farmed animals. The focus on creaturely flourishing CEFAW proposes is particularly helpful for considering fish, because it avoids versions of animal ethics that are over-invested in whether particular kinds of animals fall one side or another of particular thresholds for moral concern, and instead encourages attention on the question of what these particular creatures need to flourish. So let's turn then to the question of what a flourishing life means for fish. An important starting point for considering what it means for fish to flourish is to recognize that many of the attitudes surveyed in the previous section of this paper have been based on mistaken judgments about fish. Recent scientific research has provided strong evidence not only for the ability of fish to feel pain, but for sophisticated cognitive abilities such as good long-term memory, complex traditions within social groups, so-called Machiavellian intelligence to strategize for advantage in social contexts, tool use, learning skills, the ability to count, social recognition of individuals within and beyond their own species, social and emotional learning, and spatial cognition. An appreciation of these developed cognitive capacities and complex social behaviors is a precondition for understanding what fish need to flourish. The conclusion that fish are able to feel pain is based on evidence that fish possess the neural apparatus to perceive and respond to harmful stimuli, and the studies of their behavior indicate that they respond to pain with alterations in their behavior. Researchers have designed experiments in which fish are subjected to damaging or noxious stimuli and are shown to seek analgesia, pain relief, even against their previously established preferences. And we had a question earlier from Lynn Stedden. Lynn is a former colleague of mine at the University of Chester and is one of the researchers that's done pioneering research in this area in terms of pain recognition, perception in fish. And so we all be very grateful to Lynn for her work. Findings about whether animals are capable of feeling pain are always disputable because they represent an interpretation of evidence. But the same is the case for pain in humans. If I accidentally step on the foot of my daughter and she recoils, cries out, and subsequently limps, I have good reason to think that she experiences pain on the basis of similarities in our physiology and neural apparatus, and on the basis that she exhibits behavior that's similar to my behavior when I'm in pain. If I accidentally step on the foot of my cat, which I confess I did last week when she was lying in a very awkward place in the middle of the hall, I have similar grounds for believing that she is in pain. The demonstration that fish have relevant similarities in physiology, neural apparatus, and behavior is therefore good grounds for believing that they experience pain. The consequences of accepting the findings that fish are able to feel pain are very significant for practice in wild capture fishing and aquaculture, as well as recreational fishing. It's therefore unsurprising that there are attempts to question and discount this research, but this skepticism is becoming very hard to justify. The current state of research provides strong grounds for judging that fish feel pain and treating farmed fish accordingly. But as I've noted, recent research demonstrates cognitive abilities in fish well beyond the ability to feel pain. Experiments indicate that fish are able to recognize a particular human individual even after they've been absent for 6 months. And if fed alternately at different ends of their tank, can learn this routine and place themselves to be ready for food more quickly than some rats presented with the same task. Fish, as Gerald mentioned, can retain mental maps of their immediate environment, and they can retain those for at least 40 days. So again, the ethics of some of this experimentation would give me cause for concern, but gobies have been taken out of their environment where they're learning environments that are kind of inundated by sea at high tide, but then turn into rock pools at low tide, as Gerald mentioned. You can take them out of that environment, put them in a tank for 40 days, return them to that environment, and they still retain the information about where they should jump when they're threatened by a predator in order to land in a neighboring pool rather than on inhospitable rocks. Cleaner wrasses used to control lice in farmed fish populations in the wild recognize regular users of their cleaning services. If you've seen Finding Nemo, or is it the sequel, they're the ones, the fish that are sort of at the service station for other fish. The wrasses prioritize strangers that are more likely to go elsewhere, so showing strategic intelligence. They reconcile with fish that they accidentally bite, and they cheat by deliberately nipping the skin of regulars more frequently if they're not predators. So very complex, social intelligence behavior. Fish display social intelligence in cooperation against predators and for hunting, competing for mates, and learning from other fish. They use tools such as anvils to crush shellfish and leaves to carry eggs to safety. And recent studies have also demonstrated their preference for enriched environments over bare ones, such as those used in fish farming in the UK. And Gerard also mentioned Blue Planet 2. That's a great way of getting a sense of sort of vivid examples of tool use in fish, if you're interested in following up on that. For migratory species such as salmon and some trout, migrations of hundreds of miles between rivers and oceans is a key part of their flourishing in the wild. And it's notable that these are the only migratory species of animals to be farmed in the UK. I've not found research exploring how disallowing this migratory behaviour impacts on their welfare in particular, but there are good grounds surely for considering their confinement in crowded tanks and cages as migratory species to be problematic. In 2014, the Farmed Animal Welfare Committee, that is funded by DEFRA and advises DEFRA on animal welfare, published an opinion on the welfare of farmed fish, which identified a long list of welfare concerns. Environmental conditions, especially water quality, including pollution events and stocking density, genetics, nutrition, movement and handling, transport, which does happen to most farmed fish. They're transported around the place. Diseases and parasite infestation, where mortalities can be extremely high, as Gerald has noticed. The report also notes as concerns the lack of a requirement that diseases be diagnosed by qualified vets. So farmed fish are treated for disease in the absence of any veterinary care. The lack of legislation about the conditions in which fish should be kept. The lack of any enforcement actions or prosecutions under welfare legislation in England and Wales, the lack of requirement for a welfare trained person to be present at transport and slaughter, that monitoring of welfare among fish is often limited, that dead fish in tanks and nets may not be removed regularly, that the welfare of the growing numbers of cleaner wrasse, so these fish that are introduced in order to try and attempt to control sea lice, has not been addressed adequately, that the uniform design of ponds, raceways, pens and tanks may not allow sufficient variation for the needs or preferences of individual fish, and that daylight may be manipulated in farming context to the extent of continuous illumination. So that's denying fish any normal pattern of night and day. This is a really striking range of concerns, it seems to me, giving the impression that considerations of fish welfare in farming systems are very, very underdeveloped. Welfare schemes such as RSPCA Assured and Soil Association Organic address some of these concerns, specifying limits on stocking densities, prohibiting genetic manipulations such as artificial single-sex strains, and limiting the length of feed restrictions. So fish are often denied food for particular periods before slaughter and at other points. But it's notable that unlike other farmed animal species, neither scheme requires any environmental variation or enrichment. The CEFAW policy framework recommends that churches and other organizations reduce their overall consumption of animal products and shift to source remaining animal products from environments where farmed animals have good opportunities for flourishing. In conclusion, the rapid expansion of fish farming in the UK in recent decades has not been accompanied by appropriate assessments of the implications of this novel practice in relation to the welfare of farmed fish. In part, this may be accounted for by the persistence of a belief that fish are categorically different from other kinds of farmed animals and do not merit similar ethical concern or welfare protections. A Christian ethical approach to UK fish farming suggests that at a minimum, fish farming should be governed by regulations equivalent to those relating to other farmed animals. But beyond this, if we take seriously the growing knowledge about the complex lives and capacities of fish, there remains a serious question as to whether salmon and trout can flourish appropriately in the relatively small volumes of water in current aquaculture systems in which they're currently farmed. And this, I think, should lead us to question whether it's ethical at all to farmed fish in anything like current systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for this wonderful presentation and very thought-provoking one. Thank you for inviting us to reflect on the historical and cultural reason for our detachment from fish, and for sharing accounts and facts that challenge these cultural prejudices against fish, for pointing out the complexity of fish cognition and social life, and also for highlighting the shortcomings that sadly exist in our treatment of farmed fish in comparison to land animals, and what could and should change in this respect. So I'm sure that our audience will be eager to ask you lots of questions. So I would like to ask Chris to convey those, please.
Thank you, Clara, and thank you from me, David, for a wonderful presentation. And I'm sure there will be lots of questions. So let me look at the technology here and see what we've got. Right, yes, we have. From Robert Sluka. Thank you, David, inspiring as always. Have you found any difference in the response from churches to your work on fish relative to other terrestrial animals? And by the work, he means the CEFAW report.
Thanks very much, Bob. Good to see you. It's early days in relation to reception of the CEFAW report. We launched it in November. It was great to see that being picked up in church press and Radio 4 and things, but we're kind of at an early stage of beginning to reach out to churches to think about how the policy framework might inform the practice of churches and other Christian organisations at all levels. So if people are interested in that, do visit the Christian Ethics of Farmed Animal Welfare website. You can download it as a PDF. You can request a free print copy. And if you've got ideas for Christian organisations, local churches, churches at diocesan level, regional level, we'd be really keen for people to be picking that up and saying, look, here's a basis for us thinking again about what we're doing about farmed animal welfare. So I'd encourage people to have a look at that. But one early positive sign, I think, was that we had representatives from 6-7 major UK churches on the partner group for the project, including, as I say, the Catholic Church represented by Bishop John. And at no point in any of our deliberations over the first 2 years or so was any question raised about whether it was appropriate for us to be thinking about fish alongside other farmed animals. And for me, and you know, certainly not been any question as we've been presenting the report that it's, you know, inappropriate to have a section on fish. And so I find that fairly encouraging. I think there's a sort of growing recognition that it's inappropriate to be thinking in, you know, wholly different terms about fish, in categorically different terms. Obviously, fish are different kinds of creatures, and we need to be very attentive to the particularities of what they need in terms of their flourishing. And so we shouldn't be thinking of them as needing the same kinds of treatment as other kinds of animals that we farm. But I think we're getting further and further away from this sense of categorical difference, which would mean fish fall below some kind of threshold for moral attention. I haven't found anyone suggesting that to me recently, with the exception of a couple of questions, skeptical questions from people who enjoy angling. I guess I have encountered that once or twice. But otherwise, I think there's a growing recognition that these are creatures that should matter to us, and matter to us in similar ways to other kinds of animals.
Just unmuting myself there, sorry, thanks for that. The next question is from Paul. Fish farmers told me that their farm fishes differ more and more from the fishes of the same species in the wild. Is it acceptable that salmon farmers create different salmons that are not anymore the fishes with the very special qualities they need in the wild? Will this life in the farms reduce their muscular strength?
Thank you. Yeah, so within the Christian Ethics of Farmed Animal Welfare Project, as I've said, one of the things we're concerned about is selective breeding of all kinds of farmed animals for productivity without a very great deal of sense about what this means for the ability of animals to flourish. And so the kind of chickens that are raised, that have been bred to reach slaughter weight in sort of 35 to 40 days in broiler sheds would be sort of one very significant example of this selective breeding in other kinds of farmed animals. And it's really striking actually to begin to realize that the companies that developed expertise in broiler chicken breeding and poultry breeding saw a market opportunity to develop selective breeding in relation to farmed fish. And so many of the same companies were the ones that were originating the UK fish farming industry too. And they were bringing transferable skills in what they had done in relation to selective breeding in relation to poultry to try and create artificial strains of farmed fish that would be more efficient and more productive than the wild ancestors. As I say, farmed fish are much, much closer to wild fish than other farmed animals, which ought to strengthen our concerns about what it means to confine these wild animals in a farmed context. I think, you know, there are similar concerns about what it means to farm mink, for example, compared to other animals with much longer histories of domestication. So I think that should give us serious reasons. So the proximity to wild populations should give us one kind of concern, but then the manipulation of breeding of fish, it gives rise to a sort of independent concern. And there are lots of very particular things that we're doing to fish that we sort of haven't encountered to quite in the same extremity in relation to other animals. So we are, you know, creating monoclonal communities of farmed fish. So fish that are genetically identical because because cloning technologies have been used. We've bred fish that are infertile, that have sort of different numbers of chromosomes because they're found to grow more quickly. There are all kinds of, and then we've bred fish to all be a single sex artificially through genetic means because we found that, you know, one of the sexes of fish grows faster and more efficiently than the other. So the extremity of breeding manipulation, I think, is you know, further developed even more so than it has been done in broiler chicken, and that should give us serious concern. I mean, my sort of high-level view of this is that basically people haven't been paying much attention. People have been buying farmed salmon and trout with very little understanding of where these animals have come from. And that's meant that people in the industry haven't had to worry very much about what's being done to fish because people don't really know about it and haven't shown much indication to care. And so I'm delighted that we've put fish alongside chickens, pigs, sheep, cows in the CEFAW framework. And I'd really encourage everyone here to be going out, and insofar as you're talking to other people about animal welfare and farmed animal welfare in particular, make sure fish are always on the list, because in the end, just raising this as an issue of attention will be one of the key levers to change. One of the good things about engaging with farmed animal welfare is that this is an industry that's very sensitive to consumer demand and consumer preference. And so once we begin to realize what's going on with the farming of fish in the UK, that's going to be the strongest pressure on producers to look for ways to up their game, and on regulators to realize that the public is paying attention.
Okay. Again, we're running against the clock. So when we do have, as we have for previous speakers, more questions. So I apologize for those who will not get their question asked. We want to head into another coffee break shortly, but I have a couple more. Firstly, a comment and then a question. And the comment is from Johnson Geckley, who says, thanks very much, David, for this revealing presentation. You have answered my previous question to Dr. Taylor as to whether fish farming will be a solution to destruction of fish and marine life generally. So thank you for Johnson for that. And the final question, as it happens, one of these coincidences in life, does actually come from Gerald Taylor, the previous speaker. And Gerald asks, how has the practice of fish farming been affected by Brexit? And what are the prospects for the future?
Thanks very much.
Brexit word here.
Thanks very much for that one. Just to follow up on the other one, I think it's important to recognise, you know, if about half of fish globally are coming from wild capture fisheries and half coming from aquaculture, it's worth noticing that there are different kinds of problems in getting fish from those different environments. So in relation to wild capture fisheries, there's a problem about unsustainable fishing, which is a significant problem. During the 20th century, we fished 90% of the fish out of the sea in terms of the target species. And wild capture fishing is having, you know, devastating impacts on marine habitats, and the capture and the process of capture and killing and the sort of lack of even bothering to slaughter wild capture fish ought to be of very serious welfare concerns. But then, you know, aquaculture provides a whole different set of concerns. The conditions in which fish live are much worse, obviously, than in wild capture fisheries. There's probably more attention in the main to humane slaughter than there is in wild capture fisheries, though, you know, some recent reports have suggested really significant concerns about how far humane standards are being used reliably within UK fish farming. So I think we need to be aware that there are, and of course I've referred to this problem that we're feeding lots of wild capture fish to farmed fish, and so we get less fish out than we put in to aquaculture at the moment, which is really striking, and it's just kind of absurd issues. It's not a problem. This isn't a response to reducing pressure on wild capture fisheries, but very clearly. Sorry, now I've gone so far into that I've forgotten Gerard's question. Could you remind me, Chris? I have to apologise for being absent-minded, Professor Stereotype.
Bear with me, David, while I get back to that question.
Oh, sorry, Brexit. Of course, yeah. No, that little easy one. I think it's really worth being aware that fishing has been very much in the news in the UK in the past few weeks and in sort of years preceding in relation to Brexit, but with zero consideration of fish welfare and very little attention to the sustainability of fish stocks. You know, so we've just witnessed an ongoing battle between who gets to take fish out of the sea rather than what's happening to the fish in the capture process and in whether or not it's sustainable to fish at anything like current levels. So we ought to be really alert to that. But then obviously it's been a disaster for those concerned in the industry, involved in the industry as well. We've got this structural problem that UK fish trade relies very much on access to EU markets. And so if you try and resolve a question about how much fish UK registered vessels take out of the sea, you also need, and how far we want to exclude EU fleets, we also need to address the questions of whether the EU will give us the access to markets that UK fishing industry needs. And so it's been a complete mess. And one lamentable feature of that current mess, it seems to me, is a complete absence of any recognition that once that the independence of Brexit would allow us actually to pay more attention to regulating fishing in UK waters, move to quotas that would be much more sustainable and require changes in fishing practice, prohibiting the huge factory vessels that are just taking huge numbers of fish and a whole lot of other bycatch. And so there's a very great deal of opportunities that have been missed up to this point in this Brexit debates about fish, and I very much hope that consumer pressure could influence government in the end to think about taking control of UK waters in a way that attends to fish welfare.
Thank you for that, David. I think we'll come to a conclusion now. I'll just quickly come in, if I may, myself, as that B word has been used, just to say that I totally agree with you about the total lack of consideration of fish welfare in all this ongoing row about fishing we've seen. Without wishing to be too political, I understand, though, from the Leader of the House of Commons that the fish are now happier that they're British. Presumably he's handing them all British passports. I'm not quite sure about that. Maybe Doug will be able to deal with that if he wants to in his presentation after the coffee, or he may want to swerve that one completely when he deals with European fishing. But I'll just
been looking for a chance to deal with Rees-Mogg for a long time. Happy to do that.
So therefore we look forward to Mr. Wally against Mr. Rees-Mogg after the break. Just finally, before we go and hand over to Clara, I just wanted to make a comment that's coming from Christina regarding one of the issues mentioned earlier. And Dr. Christina Nellis, and she says this: St. Basil, in teaching on God's care for humans, recognizes that God has not left a sea urchin outside of his providential care. So arguments based upon whether they have intelligence, memory, etc. are, inverted commas, red herrings when it comes to care for fish and other aquatic life forms. So thanks very much for that